this millennial generation. You and I spent a little time talking about this before. I think that there's a sense that I get from what you see in the polling about millennials and from my own anecdotal experience that it's a generation that's very interested in community and interactions with other people. And I think there's a general perception among older Americans that the millennial generation is entirely self-centered, and that's not my impression at all. I think that what I know of millennials is they're very interested in community in a lot of ways, and a lot more than older, not just old Americans, but any Americans older than them. And in a way, this relates to the other thing we talked about that I think people, particularly in the political process, take for granted, that millennials are all liberal. And the world's about to see, we'll elect just a continuous stream of Democrats like Barack Obama as president from now on, because we take for granted. Traditionally, younger people tend to be more liberal than older people, and this generation in particular is very liberal. But what I think the data shows is that they're they don't really fit into anything that we would think of as current political categories, and that politics is going to change dramatically because of that. There was, in particular, a big Pew survey of thousands and thousands of Americans about 2 years ago that focused a lot on the millennial generation. And just one example of many found that millennials overwhelmingly are opposed to racial prejudice and think that society should and any questions about racial prejudice or gender prejudice or anything like that, very, very what we would call liberal. But when they were asked specifically about, do you want to see government affirmative action programs, do you want to see more government programs to fight discrimination, uniformly said no, by overwhelming numbers. For my generation, that would be totally inconceivable. How can you say you're against discrimination and against government programs to end discrimination? But that doesn't seem to be a dichotomy for your generation. Tell us about that. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that this is getting so much traction, and specifically what you were talking about is in your class as a business, as a tech company, trying to solve a social issue, versus you can imagine a version of this where the government comes in and says, we're going to create an app that makes you use here to vote. And I think,
or for that matter, Microsoft could have done this, right?
Or, yeah, well, maybe they could still acquire us. That's fine with me.
And what's your phone number if there is? Do we have anybody from Microsoft here?
But I do think part of our traction is this idea that technology is a solution, or the private sector is a solution, versus something government or also media. What we hear a lot of people that we talk to for voters is they're distrustful of media. Maybe that's a reason they want to dig into the facts themselves, because they think they might be getting a biased spin, whichever direction they're coming from. So that's one of the decisions we made, is to be nonpartisan, to link to all our sources, because I do think there's this distrust of large institutions among millennials, and we're trying to sort of play into that by giving them something they can trust.
Yeah, I think there's a sense that your generation is going to go out and solve all the world's problems, like the baby boomers thought, however long ago that is, 50 years ago now, 40 years ago. But instead of we're going to somehow take over these large institutions and point them in the right direction, everybody's going to kind of do their own thing. Right? It's kind of individualized in some ways. It's temporary. We're going to form an organization or put an app together that's going to address this problem. It's going to do it now. It's not going to go on forever. Then we'll move on to something else. It's all fluid. The organization comes together. It meets its aim, and then it moves on to something else. Right? That are all temporary, adaptable, fluid. In a lot of ways, the mindset of millennials reflects the technology, unless it's the technology reflecting the mindset. And I think this is kind of an interesting interplay in that. And you, again, here are an example of that.
Yeah, I do think there might be, the shortcomings of that is how do we actually tackle large problems like systemic inequality?
No, that's exactly the problem.
Yeah, and I don't think, I don't think there's an easy app solution to that.
Between my generation and your generation over privacy issues.
Yeah.
We're going to address that a little bit about, how do you folks think about coughing up all this information, which doesn't seem to disturb you as much as it disturbs people my age?
Well, the interesting thing is, so I'm a Harris grad, and I love data. I feel like we had a big enough data set, like I could move the world, right?
Yeah, would you like your data set, like we all just saw the message from your husband? Do you like being that exposed?
Well,
apparently millennials do. I don't quite get it.
My feeling is I'm willing to get something for free in exchange for telling an advertiser my preferences. That's totally fine with me. And that's definitely more millennials feel that way. I do think across generations there's a subset of people who care a lot about privacy, and the real difference between millennials and older people who care about privacy is millennials know how to, read a term of service and deal with their privacy settings. We had someone come to the site the other day and, and asked to type in your address, and she emailed us and said, "Why do you want my email password? I'm not going to type my email password into your address field." And we said, "No, we would never ask for your email password. This is just an address field." She said, "Well, people don't know that. You need to make that clear."
This was an older person.
This was an older person. So I do think there's, even though there might be similar attitudes, there are people who can take action about it more, perhaps the millennial generation. I think it's an interesting policy question. What are going to be the implications in the future of all this privacy that we've given up, and especially at the government level too? What's the government going to have to do about it?
Yeah, and again, that's another subject that we got to talk about some. I told Aviva a couple months ago I went to Estonia. I've written a number of articles about Estonia, and some of you may know it's kind of a cutting edge, the future of everything technology. So I got invited over on an EU grant, met a lot of Estonian officials and talked about this, and I was struck by several things. And part of it is just, the government has this backbone that everything's tied into. I mean, you can do your taxes in 2 minutes in Estonia because every purchase you've ever made it's all done electronically. You open up your own personal portal on the government, like IRS page, and your tax form's already filled out for you by the government because they know every penny you've made and everything you've spent. And they think that's wonderful. Taxes take 3 minutes. It's great. And everybody in Estonia seems to think it's great too. I think it's kind of creepy. And my perception was most Americans would think that was kind of creepy. But I find that younger Americans don't think that's so creepy. This information's all out there. Hey, I'm fine with it. And it seems to be this notion of, there was a Washington Post columnist who wrote a thing about this. A millennial wrote a column I really liked a year or so ago that basically said, older people think we shouldn't put all our lives up on Facebook because look what's going to happen to you. But that's the wrong way to live. We should post everything, and we're all posting this self-destructive stuff up there, and so everybody knows it's mutually assured destruction, and that's how we're going to guarantee that everything's fine. Because nobody dares dump on anybody else because then it's going to happen to you too. And that's more or less the philosophy in Estonia, and that technology kind of works to do that. And there's a lot more details about why the technology works that way. There's this stuff called blockchain that some of you probably know about. If you look into it, it's very, very interesting. That would take like 10 minutes to go through. But it all comes down to basically we're looking at a world where there's going to be a lot less privacy and stuff spread all over. And you guys seem to be okay with that. So tell us why.
Well, for now at least, I think the question is what are going to be the consequences later. But for now, I read New York Times articles, and they keep asking me to subscribe, and I just sort of don't subscribe, and I go to a different browser, and I keep getting it for free. I think that probably we're going to find out what the consequences are of that probably soon.
Kind of like microwave ovens.
Yeah.
So somewhere down the road.